Oh, Dwayne. Oh, Dwayne. All right, Tom is back. Awesome. All right. Let's see.
I better not be.
Y'all, thanks for joining us. So today we have our Borrowed Black Hands panel discussion featuring some of the loveliest folks in the industry, and I'm very excited to have them all here today to discuss this important topic. But before I begin, I would love to introduce who I am because I think that's rather important. My name is Lauren Taylor, and I'm the owner and co-founder of Focus on Health. Focus on Health is a company that advocates for the health and wellness of the food and beverage sector. We started in early 2020, which is crazy to think. Time is just like a weird concept now. I don't even think it exists. But so we've been operating for about a year, and it's been a really amazing journey. So this month, for February, Black History Month, we are putting on our initiative, Fill in the Gaps with The Blend by Beep Suntory. And it is really focusing and embracing those gaps that exist in history. And so what we're doing with the multiple activations and programs that we're putting on is really focusing on how to retell those stories, how to tell those stories, and how to celebrate those accomplishments and innovations. So today we're going to take a walk through history dating back to the early 1400s and discuss the impact and innovations of African Americans in food, spirits, wine, even presidential campaigns and activism. So each panelist will be discussing a moment in history that resonates and inspires them. And without further ado, how about we start with introducing the lovely panelists that we have today. So I introduce you all to Ms. Chow McCoy.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Lauren, and Focus on Health for having me. I am Chow McCoy, certified sommelier from New York City, currently living between Portugal and New York. And I'm excited to bring the first topic to you all. So I originally wanted to come up with something that was going to be extra dynamic and I had all the facts for. And Dwayne in the beginning actually mentioned that's the reason why he left wine is because you're always constantly being tested on knowledge more than actually serving wine is probably equally as important. So in this case, when we talk about Black hands in African-American history, we know there's more than just a few gaps. There's tons of pages and books missing in our own history. And the same is for wine and our part in this, in wine culture as it relates to especially America. So this is a big undertaking. And I feel like this is my first time presenting some of the notes and facts that I've been piecing together over years, but it will relate in a second to my own story and also Portugal. So the definition of sommelier is a wine steward, basically wine waiter servant, and that will give you clues into how the Black narrative actually relates to the work. So if you first want to think about the African Americans' position in wine, we have to first think about what wine could they possibly be serving. And I think that's the reason why a lot of people are confused or don't know where to start when they're looking for the first Black sommelier is because the word Black or African-American and sommelier together, if you Googled or research, would not make sense. So we need to first break down the definition and make the context. So we're looking for someone who is of African descent and who also would be in a service or servant position. And so that's why I told Lauren and the panelists here that we have to go back to the 1400s because we're thinking about the boats that first arrived on the port cities that actually would translate to the service workers, AKA slaves, who came here to do the work that we now call sommeliers. So just go on this journey with me. Again, this is some of my notes that I have from over the few years, especially with me moving to Portugal. As we know, they have the age of the discovery, and it's in the 1400s, early 1500s, when we actually see the boat arrive to the States, or present day States. And there is some context that I have notes everywhere here that I'm gonna try to make some connections in really quickly to see why this is important. The island of Madeira plays an important role in the triangle and the transatlantic slave trade, as well as trade routes. And so we have the English is also involved here when they are actually looking for textiles, they're looking for wine because they're basically blocking out France. And then they're also going down to South America and then back over to Africa, right? So this is the trade route. They're bringing what they know, what they need to places that don't have it and so forth. I'm going to touch on it just a little bit because we could spend forever talking about rum, but sugarcane was being produced in Madeira. And then once they actually start planting sugarcane in Brazil, there was no need for this small island of Madeira to plant sugarcane anymore. So that was the main, let's say, export from Madeira to the States during this trade. And so therefore Madeira needed something else to be able to make it more valuable. So they ripped out all the sugarcane plants and actually put vines in place. So I'm not going to spend any more time talking about that, but I want you to know that's why Madeira started having the Madeira wine that we know today. Okay, so then from there, let me bring us a little bit closer to the 1600s. We'll have the discussion about who was drinking Madeira now, how did it come about? At the end of the day, it was considered just bad wine once it arrived in the States. And then for those who don't know, the voyage itself is what started heating up the wine, or as they say, bastardizing. I hate saying this word. I'm waiting for Dwayne to jump in and help me out. But yes, so bastardizing, there we go. Because I know there's heating the wine up, ended up making present day Madeira, and therefore it had to go on this route or voyage in order to become stronger. Obviously the word fortified is in the fortified wine category, and it needed the voyage to actually become, as you can say, more, the quality level will go up, or the price of it as well. Sometimes they would even leave some of the Madeira on the boat to even go all the way to India just to heat up longer and bring it back before consumption. So the folks that were in these, as they call them, Madeira parties, their main cities for that would be Boston, New Orleans, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Charleston, and Savannah. And so these important port cities is where you can find the ovens, or which is basically made from the attics of the homes of the wealthy. So these were people who were bringing in anything. So whether they owned a boat, whether they're doing other exporting, whether it's of slaves or other goods, folks who basically made a sense of wealth for themselves in the States. And now they had money to basically store properly the Madeira without going on this voyage trip to India, to South America, and then bringing it back and waiting for it to have the best quality of Madeira. So that gives me, or gave me some, I guess, some length or some rope to do more digging, because now it's just a matter of figuring out the servants or slaves of the folks who actually invested their time in having these style structures in their house, right, in their attics. So that doesn't mean I have all the answers today, but I do want to let you know some of the top houses in Savannah. We have Andrew Lowe House, and he had his main butler, or his right-hand man, was Tom Milledge, Milledge. And his years of life is from 1818 to 1886. And he was known, or on his obituary, is also known, he had the respect of both white and colored people. As you can imagine, anyone who has the information of such wine preservation, et cetera, they would be, let's say, race ends up being not important when you're handling what they care very much about. Then we have the Davenport House, which is where the largest, I believe to date, Madeiras are being housed in Savannah. And then it's the Habersham family, and that's the son of Todd. We have William Habersham, and he's known as the developer of what we call from in Madeira rainwater. So he's also easily to be understood the first winemaker, even though the text doesn't read this way, of wine in America, because it wasn't the vines in the US that actually made, it was the Madeira on this voyage and then being blended here in the States that makes Madeira more American than it does Portuguese or even European. It had to take the trip here for it to be discovered. I want to make sure I kind of end with a quote and some notes from a book that I am doing most of my research from, or taking clues from and doing extended readings. There is no official name of the servant, but in the city of Penn, as it was in the time in the 1800s, there was older, they said they described him as an older Negro servant with mahogany skin that goes by the name of Uncle John. And he was the butler and servant of Hamilton, no first name. And this is after the president Hamilton's life, so I know it's no connection to him. But there was someone making references of the way the older servant was actually moving around the room. They said as he was cleaning up around the space, his final job he seemed to enjoy. You could see from the smile on his face that as he inspected the decanters, he lifted one by one, looked through them for clarity into the light. He then placed the ones that he felt that was too cold near the firewood or hearth, as it says, so right in front of the fireplace in order to warm them up. As I just mentioned, the importance of having those oven-like structures in the attic. So in this case, he knew before service it needed to be warmed up again if it was too cold at a certain point. And then they said the pleasure of the color. He actually makes a note about how, colored people enjoy color. Now we can take that for what it's worth. And he mentioned the brilliance of the garnets and the amber tints that came from the wine. And then there was a note about how there was another servant in another house who then knew or started to use a nail to extract the wine from the bottle before service. And so the corkscrew was already invented at this time. However, maybe the shape of this, there's a mixture between cities that actually served Madeira in demijohns and then others who served Madeira out of bottles. The main cities that did that was Charleston and Boston. So all the other port cities I mentioned had to come up with other ways on how to extract just enough without pouring everything out. And then the gentleman, William Tint, said about Uncle John, I have no doubt Uncle John here has a good notion of Madeira. And then in response, Uncle John says, it's the smell. So that's the end of my presentation about Madeira. And I guess I would call the original sommeliers who are Black people.
I love that. Yeah, it's such a, I think it's one of those things we don't often consider or think about. So thank you for sharing that research. And can you tell us what the name of that book is that kind of inspired or sparked your interest to have this discussion?
I have a lot of books that I'm pulling from, but the one I took the quotes from just now was A Madeira Party.
Okay, awesome.
Okay, literally, if you Google that, it's the only one that's out there. So, and I mentioned in the beginning, I was going to tell my connection, but for those who heard me say earlier, I moved to Portugal on my own personal discovery and connection with wine. And so I've been tracking the story of how the Portuguese in wine in connection to Black people, as well as America, how it plays an important role. So there's a lot more text that I have, but all of it is in Portuguese, as you can imagine. And so therefore, me learning the language along with reading those books has been much slower because I'm not Portuguese fluently yet. So it's been an interesting journey as I'm out there and continue to talk about wine.
That's amazing. And, I have to plug this. If y'all don't know, Chal McCoy just put on a really amazing initiative called Lip Service Challenge to really just allow a platform and space for those individuals who are interested in learning another language. And I'm taking it so I can make sure these resources are available in Spanish to Spanish speaking individuals. So check it out. It's great. It's amazing. And we love her for doing it.
Thank you.
Absolutely. All right, so now we're gonna have Tiffany Berrier introduce herself and give us this amazing presentation. I'm really excited for it.
Happy Friday. Happy Friday. You are my Friday date. I'm happy about it. Happy to be here, busy girl, and happy to be busy because I'm this busy because we want to hear more history, more storytelling. Those that know me or do not know me, I love to tell a good story. I love to bring in the details and really break it down comfortably. I love some of the strict outlines of a story, but I love to break it down kind of drunk history style, Comedy Central, fun. I can connect with you. One thing about this industry that I've absolutely loved is the service aspect of it all. I've been in this industry, it feels like my entire life. I've come from Lafayette, well, little tinier town from Lafayette, Louisiana, where I've either played restaurant as a child or had to serve the preacher or the family when my grandmother invited people over. I knew how to set a table by the age of 5. I knew service with the back of my hand. I knew yes, ma'am, no, ma'am, very quickly. But once I got into this industry, I realized that I was giving some of the best service naturally, not understanding truly where this really was pulling from, coming from the South. Service, both of my grandmother's maids, both of my grandfather's sharecroppers. We've been out here in the fields. We know how to make do and make money. And when it came to the restaurant, I really understood um, the kindness of being polite. But then once I started to do more research and get more engulfed in my culture, get more engulfed in this history, there's a huge narrative missing. Here I am in hospitality, jumping out of college, making a quick coin, thinking this is just a quick job, but not realizing how much history goes into it. So when I think about the history of the country, well, there's that part, the division instantly. But I think about the hierarchy, the clergy, and obviously the presidential side of things. Every president in the White House, starting with George, absolutely had slaves in the home. It's just a thing of the Americans to have slaves in the home. Um, this is the highest of the high, as Shaw was saying, like the time frame of springing in a sort of service in the 14, 1500s. Here we are coming into a country, and here we are with actual presidents, a house, and a style of service, and who is doing it. It's Black people, and they are enslaved at this time. And so when I think about that, I think about everything from linen down to tea service, down to boiling water, down to obviously the fields, the grains, clothing, everything. I mean, a president never did too much for themselves. And it was all our hands. So when I think about that as a service coming from our homeland of Africa, or even other countries coming into these port cities. This is all a natural a thing that they have to do. These presidents, these leaders are not telling their slaves, their help, their servants how to do it. They're telling them what to do. Make me tea. How does one make tea? They're not telling them to start the fire here, chop the wood, get this, certain kind of pot, rinse it this way, become a botanist, things like that. Carolyn Branham was one of George Washington's servants. She not only took care of Martha, but she was George's favorite girl, I'm sure for a few different reasons. She handled everything in the house from the bedding, the light fixtures. She was said to even understand how to forage. Sorry, the dog is totally playing right now. And know how to take care of everything in the home. One thing that's interesting about the presidential slaves and servants to me is that when one person dies off or their children, obviously you have their family, the president didn't go out and scout new slaves, new servants. It was all inherited. It was all handed down. Unfortunately, they were gifted slaves. Let's bring it into Thomas Jefferson. We know Thomas. We know Thomas was this extreme party guy, this well-traveled gentleman. He is all of the things. He owned over 700 slaves, and the plantation that he owns. I'm going to be a little. I'm highlighting the word university, but the kind of slaves that this man owned, it was a schooling. There were so many different styles of education and work done on his plantation. It was insane. Some of the things that have come out of Thomas Jefferson's plantation and his ownership was botany, foraging, grafting, sewing, mathematics. There was so many things that he unfortunately offered, just a little more with education, and him being so well traveled because he also slept with his slaves. He had multiple families and multiple integrated children with some of his slaves. And so a part of him that stood for his white side of culture and his presidency, he also had, I want to call it heart, but a piece that he cared for the Blacks and enslaved. He made sure there was some education, there were books on site, but the service aspect is some things that he allowed them to do in a different sort, sending them to France, allowing them extra homes on the outside. Juniper Evans, his number one, Juniper Evans was given to him at 21 from his father. Juniper perfected the apple cider, grafting trees and really growing out these apples in Virginia so that he can give us cider that was almost tasted like it was in England. The style of service there through presidents, respected yet silence, is what's painful. Yet you look for some of the silver lining. And as a Black woman, as suppressed as slavery is and as suppressed as service is, I think about some of the things that the slaves that the presidents had a small privilege to. The privileges, some of them being documented, a few of them being documented. Monroe, Jackson, Grant, they all had slaves as well, documenting their names. And moving forward, of course, as the culture is being documented more with recipes and service, those things kind of just own homage. Eugene Allen, who I'm sure we'll talk about later. Of course, the movie of The Butler goes on his name. There's a silence, yet a homage that I see. My grandparents, as I said in the beginning of what I said, or slaves, maids, and sharecroppers. Yet the honor that they were given from their owners, maybe one they passed or handed down property or having their name written down or even having their recipe shared is it's pretty important because we're still digging and we're researching to find great names that presidents own. So I am getting choked up on that because when I think about it, we're digging so hard right now on names that aren't found, yet we know that they're the foundation of service. I'm so sorry, I just got completely choked up thinking about the names that we can't find right now, yet the power that they've put into some of the candidates that we've had that keep this country and have kept this country in a certain place. So service for me has always been very important, the style, the silence, yet their names aren't heard. So the honor and the homage to continue to dig their names out is something I'm still working for. I'm sorry, I just got really emotional on that. Forgive me so much. Being kind as a Black person in this industry gets difficult. And when we research those names, the hard work and the intelligence and the excellence, the perseverance that comes from that, especially on such a caliber as in the White House or in Congress, is very important and valuable, and it's not shared enough. And so service in a whole is very important for this culture, and being in it now and being around some of my favorite people on here right now, still wanting to do it and still researching and honoring and uplifting those names are very, very, very important. So that completely like snatched away all the things I wanted to say, but I really wanted to just share some heart and feeling on how hard it is to be Black in this industry, but continue to shine out regardless of the platform or the past.
Thank you,
I'm
Tiffany.
so sorry.
No, don't be sorry. I think that the heart and obviously the passion that is associated with the topic is important. You're right. It's not discussed enough, and I think one of the things that made me so excited and happy about hosting this panel discussion and having you as a part of it is that I know this is something that you're truly passionate about. And for those of you who don't know or don't follow Tiffany, she does do this. This is her life's work. Like she does this on a daily basis and she's constantly sharing these stories, which is really amazing. Additionally, one thing I want to point out is when I first had the pleasure of speaking with her, one of the things she says that resonates with me every day is, you know, we have the power to ensure that the history that was lost in the past is not lost in the future. We are currently living in history. So by telling these stories and by sharing our stories, we can ensure that this cycle is stopped. So I think it's important that we're having these discussions, that they're being recorded and they're constantly shared. So I really appreciate you taking the time to be here today.
Thanks, friends. Forgive me. I just it gets difficult sometimes, and we are truly healing from the research. And it's hard because we're researching so hard to see all this great work and all this great work that was done and not given enough to. So
Yeah,
I'm not going to apologize anymore for being sensitive and emotional right now. And forgive me for negating from other names, but there's a lot of research that we all have to do and really share. All in all, whether we talk about spirits or not, the hospitality industry is on service, and the Black and African Americans, people of color, are the foundation of this. And we just need to share more stories, hands down.
absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much. All right. Well, Dwayne, I don't know how the hell you're going to follow that, but good luck. So
Well,
Dwayne is going to be discussing the cocktail movement, which transitions very nicely from what Tiffany has just discussed. So, Dwayne, I would love if you could introduce yourself and then, start your discussion.
before I even introduce myself, I thank you for setting me up, putting me behind Shah and her deep history of claiming that now I know where I come from. I know why I like wine and my sommelier and my servitude. And then it's amazing to hear the history of the tradition of the service staff being passed on from president to president, which still happens today. Every other government position, cabinet is chosen and refilled by the new president, except for the butler and the house staff. And that's amazing that tradition, even though they are paid wage earners today, they are still handed from administration to administration. And anyway, my name is Dwayne Sylvester, and I am a DC born and raised hospitality being. I've been in the service industry. If you ever ask me outside of these forums, I tell you I've been doing this since I was 2. I was born in Washington, D.C. My family, both parents are from Trinidad and Tobago. And even in the Caribbean, that sense of hospitality, it seems as it was ingrained in me from a young age. So I couldn't help but smile when Adrian mentioned, yes, ma'am, no, ma'am, from a young age, and being there to help and assist, invisibly so, at a very young age. When we talk about filling in the gaps, as it relates to beverage, growing up in the 80s, 90s, if you were looking for bartending references, there weren't a lot outside of on television. There was, you had the guy from Cheers, you had Isaac on the Love Boat, but that was it, and as we got into the early 2000s, the stories of bartending, and you start looking up the history of bartending and wanting to figure out what's going on with where did this bartending come from? How did it evolve? How was it maintained and sustained? There's a gentleman that wrote a book in the 1800s by the name of Jerry Thomas. And Jerry Thomas had this distinct look. It was a thick mustache curled on the ends, a white shirt, puffy sleeves with shirt garters on it, a white man, suspenders. If you can't get that picture, any bartender in any mixology setting or prestigious bar setting in the early 2008 on, honestly, if you walk into any mixologist or speakeasy type bar, it was the white guy standing there with the addition of tattoos, but with the mustaches. And I never could connect to that, and many people looking up can connect to that. And there were no other stories. There are no other stories. And as Lauren just underscored, who is telling the stories? Who's writing down? Who's recording for history to be found? And luckily, another beverage historian around 2010 put me on track through our own National Archives and set me to look up a publication called The Colored American. And in The Colored American, there were documented articles of incorporation for a mixologist club here in Washington, D.C., which blew my mind. So I went back to David to ask what else he'd uncovered. And we talked about, you talk about George Washington and his slaves or his servants, and there's names that would just come out of like Cato Alexander worked for George Washington, and then we had Richard Francis, or Uncle Dick, as you will, that's born in Virginia but worked in Washington D.C. at a place called Hancock's on Pennsylvania Avenue. John Dabney, a caterer out of Virginia, It was amazing how in the northern South, some of the workers were assigned titles and given some credit for their work on their plantations by their owners. So it's awesome I went to school here. So you grow up and you think the North was good, the South was bad. The North freed the blacks, the South had all the slaves. And when you read, there was a very small portion of people that owned, so you had to be wealthy. You had to be wealthy to own slaves. And so in the South, people were more comfortable around Black people. They weren't shocked to see a Black person in a public setting. In the North, if you were around someone that was of color, they were usually well educated or had earned the right to be in your presence. So if we look at around, slaves got freed in 1865. 1865 was also about the time where the country is moving westward expansion, and there was a railroad company in Chicago. I forget the name of the railroad company, but they worked with a gentleman by the name of George Pullman, and they gave him 2 railroad cards around the same time, 1864, 1865. Long story short, he designed this luxury sleeper car. And by 1867, he was employing freed slaves. So he had this huge labor force where he had highly trained engineers or conductors on his railway, but he only hired ex-slaves that were trained in service to be porters on his rail cars, and they would be forever referred to as Pullman porters. Eventually, some of them even took his name. People would call them either Boy or George. But his criteria for selecting these perfect workers was that not only were they trained, but they would be able to give the upper class a taste of the good life and give the wealthy a taste of what they were accustomed to while they were on the road. So it's amazing that I mean, he was not I'm not labeling him a good guy at all, but he ended up being one of the largest employers of Black labor in the country, certainly post-slavery. And yeah, the Pullman porters were overworked and seriously underpaid. This is one of the first instances of where tipping was instituted so that to supplement wages. And you talk about when Shah mentioned Uncle John, you're going to talk about that stereotypical big broad smile and say, "Yes, sir, boss. Anything you like, sir." And giving that extra feel good to the people that you were serving to get a little bit extra of a wage came out of that Pullman porters. And I mean, you look at the hospitality industry today, still here, certainly in America. You go to Europe, tipping's not a part of their culture. It's few and far in between. Bartenders, servers today, we fight for those tips. Why? Because it's been ingrained into us that if we work hard, we will get more. Not that we should show up to work and get paid what we deserve to get paid for doing the job, but if we do a good job, somebody's going to give us a little bit more, right? So, I mean, you talk about lasting effects of slavery and filling in the gaps of where things have come from and how they've been pushed forward. Pullman had the largest African American workforce right around the time where unions were being organized. But it took the blacks had to fight an extra 10 to 15 years to organize under Pullman. And when I had notes somewhere actually. You talk about as late as 1955, Edgar Nixon, Pullman Porter, member of the union, was instrumental in forming the boycotts in Montgomery, Alabama, for after Rosa Parks was arrested. And due to work commitments, he enlisted the assistance of a young Reverend Martin Luther King to help organize and maintain those boycotts. So when we're talking about the service industry and how people that were placed that in adverse conditions where they were forced to work long hours and still uplift their community. They were the poorest, but they were getting a fair wage, even though they were working 400 hours a week. They were able to travel the country and see the country and spread news of events to who they met across the country. You come back to, let me bring it back to drinks here in Washington, D.C. Around that same time, well, let's go early 20th century, not in Washington, D.C. We talk about Tom Bullock. Tom Bullock was a bartender in Louisville, Kentucky. And he was well known for the drinks that he put in the glass, so much so that he was given quarter and allowed to socialize almost as an equal. He wrote a cocktail book that was published in 1917, right before Prohibition. And I often say that this cocktail book served as a snapshot of drinking culture in America before it was to be lost. Because some people will tell you that we never really recovered from Prohibition, from these pre-Prohibition cocktails that were all the rage in the last 5 years, that we've had to dig up. Could have been lost forever unless some of these books had been written. Washington, D.C., known for being the nation's capital, the seat of power, we know very little about the bars that were operating here in our nation's capital, except for that there was a pastor that had a register of the 960 registered porters, same term, but not having to do with working on the railroads, working in the saloons, the licensed taverns here in Washington, D.C. The only Washington, D.C. bartender you ever get to hear about is Uncle Dick Francis, or Richard Francis, who I mentioned earlier, who eventually was given the bar at the U.S. Capitol. So had the ear of the most powerful people in the country. And you think about even in his position, he was born early 19th century, 1820s. So he was working in the DC before the Civil War, through the Civil War, and seeing all types of uprisings and such, and was still had the ear of the affluent whites. The blacks in the service industry coming up through times of adversity. We're talking about before, during slavery, pre-civil rights, for some reason, were able to operate as if they were invisible among their, for lack of a better word, their white masters, whoever they were serving, their guest, if you want to call it, however you want to phrase it. Imagine this: a white woman would feel comfortable changing her clothes in a sleeper car with a black male servant attendant in close proximity, because they were invisible. They wouldn't dare. We had the opportunity to become that fly on the wall. And it's amazing to me how little of these stories, as mentioned before, are documented so that we can go back and, well, it's not amazing. These aren't nice stories. They're not flattering stories they're amazing to us because we're hearing them now, but they're certainly unflattering to who would have been in power before. And that's why we don't have these stories. I'm not disillusioned about where these stories are or why they weren't told, or we know why they weren't told, or at least we have a good idea, because I mean, like, it was in Greek history, they mentioned in school that, it's the winners of wars that write the history. It's the winners of battles that get to tell the story. And right now, fortunately, some of the spoils of those wars of those days are still here, and we're able to find some stories and write some of our own. How much time I got?
I'll give you 2 more minutes, sir.
No, I certainly could wrap up there. As it pertains to, I mentioned this on the call before, when we look at things that we still do today, one of the things that ties over for me that it still blows my mind is how much adornment that the Virginia bartenders used to place on their cocktails. They used to embellish their cocktails and make them beautiful. They took pride in what they were putting forward to. And was it out of pride, or was it out of not wanting to waste the weed that was growing up and down the hillside that was mint? But they had the foresight to embellish these drinks. And I'm talking specifically about the mint julep, but I think that level of attention to garnish still we see today throughout our Instagram posts, and that need to add something vain, add some vanity to something that normally is just sustenance, right? We're eating food, now we're going to make it look just amazing. We're going to drink this, but not only do I want you to enjoy it, I want everyone that sees me carry it across the room. So there was a sense of pride that certainly I hope it was out of a sense of pride for what I was doing, and not the situation that I've been placed where these things, and I think that a lot has been laid down for us that we don't realize we're still affected by, not least of which is just the garnish on a drink.
Well, Dwayne, you never cease to amaze me. No, that was amazing. I really appreciate you sharing that. It's certainly something that's very important to consider and think about. And sometimes I truly believe when we state things and we say them, we make them a little bit more tangible, and also provide others with an opportunity to really just change their perspective lens, right? So no, I really appreciate you being here and dealing with me. So thank you for being a part of this. You have a lot of knowledge, and it's nice to hear your contribution to this cause.
I am here for the Courvoisier, okay?
Don't be mistaken. All right.
All right.
All right. So now we have Miss Lynn House discussing a topic I'm not actually very familiar with, but very excited to hear about. So Lynn, I would love if you could introduce yourself and then let us have it.
Absolutely. Well, hello everybody, and I want to thank Lauren and Focus on Health for this amazing evening, filling in the gaps, telling our stories. My name is Lynn House. I'm the National Spirit Specialist and Portfolio Mixologist for Heaven Hill Brands. But I'm going to do something, and I'm not going to talk about spirits or really hospitality or anything at all, which are topics that I know a lot of people are used to hearing from me. But when talking with Lauren, she's like, I want to know what inspires you in filling in the gaps. And so I'm going to talk about activism, and I'm going to talk about the 60s, and I will tell you why the 60s are very important to me. But first, I think it's super important that we are having this topic, this subject matter of filling in the gaps. We have to tell our stories. I think we've heard from Cha, from Tiffany, from Dwayne, that our stories have not been told throughout time. And I'm talking predominantly people of color, particularly Black people in the United States. And why it's important to tell our stories is our stories inspire those who come after us, right? Learning is earning, learning is everything. Our stories inform today's society. There are learning lessons from those stories that we can incorporate with what we do today. And us telling our stories and not letting anybody else tell our stories also dispels so many of the myths that have been out there. And that's really why I wanted to talk about the 60s and activism, and really not talk about spirits or hospitality at all. But as Dwayne, I thought you really gave a great prelude to talking about how important people who were in hospitality were towards political activism in the 1960s. So why are the 60s so important to me? I was born in 1965. So while for some, probably the majority of you people, this is history for you, this is my story, this are events that have happened within my lifetime, and we're still dealing with all the trickle down effects of that. But I want to jump back a little bit to where Tiffany and Cha were talking about in the 1800s and look at where we were. So a century back, 1868, really important date. The 14th Amendment gave Black people, quote unquote, equal protection under the law. That's 1868, the 14th Amendment. Think about that and think about where we are today. 2 years later, 1870, the 15th Amendment gave Black men the right to vote. Women couldn't vote yet, so that's a whole other topic and long conversation. We can do this in March, Lauren, when we hit Women's History Month. But by 1870, Black people, we quote unquote, under the Constitution, had equal protection, and Black men, because at that point in time only men could vote, had the right to vote. There, even though we were in this period of Reconstruction, we know that a lot of people weren't happy about the end of slavery and what was going on. And so laws were being created to kind of circumvent what the Constitution now in the 14th and 15th Amendment gave people of color the ability to do. Very important case in 1898, Wesley versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court deemed equal, separate, but equal as law. And that is really the birth of Jim Crow. And so when we talk about filling in the gaps and what's important is I look at my own life, and my grandparents grew up in Jim Crow. My parents grew up in Jim Crow. I, born in 1965, was born at the end of Jim Crow officially as separate but equal. And so activism is really important, and this is why this is such a passion of mine. So we want to actually flash forward to the 1960s. In fact, February 1st, 1960, a hospitality incident in Greensboro, North Carolina. 4 Black men dared to sit at a counter, Woolworth counter, and have sandwiches and soda. And if you are a follower of history in the civil rights movement, you know this was huge. There were riots and protests and everything. They were refused service. They refused to leave. It turned somewhat violent. But what is important is that these were 4 students, and this particular moment led to the formation of SNCC, SNCC. So I kind of want to challenge everyone out there listening. If you haven't read a history book, if you just think about what you learned in school, when was the first time you ever heard of SNCC? Can anybody tell me who SNCC is? And so SNCC was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. That's actually what that acronym stands for. And when we talk about what motivates us, where our stories come from, this is a very, very personal story for me. If you look on the original rosters of SNCC, you'll see a name, Stuart House. That's my dad's younger brother. And he's one of the original founders of SNCC. In fact, at 19, he was the president of the Mississippi and Alabama chapters, and he was the youngest president of SNCC. So I'm telling stories that need to be told that haven't been told. This is how we fill in the gaps, because this is how we learn how to progress forward. What's interesting when you think about SNCC, when you think about the civil rights movement, when you think about all these things that were happening, as Dwayne talked about, people coming together, sharing information, kind of invoking change, there were really two schools of thoughts that happened. And there was the school of thought of mobilization, and that was Martin Luther King's, really his movement that he oversaw. And when you were an organization of mobilization, what was different was there was a figurehead, and that actually created vulnerability, which is why he was targeted, and Medgar Evers was targeted, and so many other civil rights leaders were targeted because they were these figureheads. And at this point in time, the FBI, the CIA, our government was looking to kind of squash everything. So by getting rid of figureheads, it would end these movements. Then you had SNCC. SNCC, their whole idea was through organization. They didn't want a specific figurehead. They wanted to create a movement. And we see direct parallels within that, within Black Lives Matter. So as it actually addresses to the Black Panther movement, which I think is particularly interesting, we know that 1964 was the Freedom Summer of voter registration. SDS, which is the Student Delivery Service, is founded, ironically, that's founded in Miami University, which is where I ended up going to college. And part of what they did to really kind of create equality and eradicate the inequality in voting rights was building allyship. And I think there's something that when we tell our stories and we're filling in gaps that we have to recognize and say to each other. And it's something that we're seeing happening today, which I think is so important because so many of us are sharing this message. And there's a reason why we're mimicking this message, is because we already know it works. And that's the recognition of the fact that oppression isn't just about race, it's about class, status, and power. And one of the things that made SNCC so powerful was that they recognized that. And they knew that to be successful, they had to build allyship. And they built allyship through poor white people, because poor white people and poor Black people were in the same state. They lacked status, they lacked class, and they lacked power. They lacked access to education, jobs, and everything that went with it. So which is really interesting is in the 1960s, the Democratic Party was the party of white supremacists. The Dixiecrats would change all of that, but they were the party of white supremacists. And as I said, you controlled people, and a lot of people were illiterate. And so what they did at ballots was a voter knew what candidate to vote for because they looked for a white chicken. And that was the party of the white Democrats. And you voted for a white chicken because you couldn't necessarily read the name. And remember, you're in the South, so it's only white people voting. So they created, and I've got to try and figure out, Lauren, how to get you these original renderings. I've been bugging my uncle for them. But what they created were, they were like, okay, we're going to go in, we're going to build allyship, and this is how we're going to make change, right? And these were youth, and these were students, and these were people who were educated, as Dwayne was talking about, and had access to the world, and they were trying to bring their lessons into the South. So they created an emblem of a black cat, because a black cat could eat a chicken, but it was not thought of as being super like menacing. So they put fangs on the black cat. And that is the first Black Panther. It literally looks like Tom and Jerry black cat with fangs on it. It's ridiculous. How innocuous. But that was that. But they had created allyship within these poor white communities. And they're like, we need you to vote for candidates who are actually working for all of us. And these were illiterate communities. So you got to look for this black cat. And so that is the birth, really, of the Black Panther Party. Now, I think it's super interesting because I went in, I was kind of like, and this happened in Loudon County in Alabama. And these candidates that were part of this new Black Panther Party won. And not only were, white people who are underrepresented, but Black people were also, getting into local office as sheriffs and such. So they were represented by this. but it's interesting when if you go to like Wikipedia or Google, they'll be like Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale created this party in 1966. What they actually created was a separate chapter, and I think this is really important to know. And this was the Oakland chapter. The actual official name of that party was the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. Because when we look at all the injustices that are happening in our country, when we look at police violence, when we look at inequality, when we look at lack of access for voting, and voting is the best way that anybody can help evoke change. And I think in hospitality, to kind of tie it back to that topic, this is really important because particularly the pandemic of the last year, all of the inequalities, particularly in communities of color, have just been like exposed as far as lack of access to health, as far as financial literacy, as far as, voting and other things. But this party was actually the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. And it was created not just for Black people, but they actually, they wanted to forge an alliance between, if you look back to SNCC and that kind of original movement, between Black people, people of color, white people, everyone who was underserved, because it was a recognition that there were so many that were underserved. And so I think it's really important that today, when we think of modern activism, and I see so many people in the hospitality industry, myself, Lauren, a lot of people on here, Tiffany, telling stories, but what we're doing is that recognizing of community and that solidarity of community, and knowing the growth from which this comes from is what's going to propel us to better equity. They were influenced by Malcolm X in 1965, tying it back to how it personally affects me. I was born in 1965, which is the year that Malcolm X was executed. But they wanted to establish African-American community survival programs. They wanted to destroy economic oppression. And they did this through survival programs, Head Start, legal aid, children's free breakfast program, voter registration programs, and assistance for the poor. In 1969, J. Edgar Hoover described the Black Panthers as the greatest threat to national security. And so, in kind of wrapping up why I bring this up and talk about it, we think about Black Lives Matter now, activism, as we are really so trying to shift the world and tip the balance to a direction of equity. J. Edgar Hoover got to tell the story and got to create the dialogue and got to tell the narrative that the Black Panther Party was the most dangerous organization in the United States. And we're seeing some of those similarities now. And so for me, filling in the gaps is really telling our own stories and understanding our history, and not letting anybody else take that narrative away from us. And there you go.
Thank you, Lynn. I love that. This is one of the topics I was very unfamiliar with, and this is awesome. If there are any books you'd recommend specifically for this topic, I'd really be interested in.
I'll share a link with you that my uncle gave you. I mean, there's so many, and part of it is there aren't a lot of books. I mean, I'm interested in the movie that's coming out about Black Panthers, but if you look at it, they say inspired by, and that's always a dead giveaway. And I'm like, well, who's telling the story? Who's telling the story? We have to tell our stories. So
tell Lynn, I don't want a book. I want your phone number. I'm calling you tomorrow.
Oh man, thank you so much. I think that's just such sorry, I just muted myself. Technology. It's such an important topic, and I know it's not necessarily involved with the food and beverage sector, but it's still of great importance. So thank you for sharing that. Awesome. And then last but certainly not least, we have Mr. Adrian Miller on our panel as well, and I will have him introduce himself, and then we can get started.
All right, and good to be with you. And if you can load my PowerPoint, that would be great. So I'm Adrian Miller. I am a food writer, former attorney, politico, and a certified barbecue judge. I call myself the Soul Food Scholar. My tagline is dropping knowledge like hot biscuits, and I certainly hope to do that tonight. So I'm going to talk about soul food trends and basically just give you a little bit of background about soul food and what I see is happening right now in soul food culture. Next slide. So I wrote a book on the history of soul food that won the James Beard Award for Outstanding Scholarship and Reference in 2014. And then I also wrote a book on the history of Black chefs in the White House called The President's Kitchen Cabinet. And this April, my next book on African American barbecue, it's called Black Smoke, African Americans in the United States of Barbecue, will drop on April 27th. And I wrote that book because I'm tired of white dudes getting all the credit. All right, next slide. So what's a typical soul food meal? So I would say a typical soul food meal is, entrees would be fried chicken, fried catfish, or maybe chitlins. For the uninitiated, chitlins are pig intestines, not for everybody. Greens as a side dish, and in soul food culture, the popular greens are collard, kale, mustard, turnip, and cabbage. So if you discovered kale in the last 5 to 10 years, welcome to the party. We've been eating them for about 300. Black-eyed peas, candy jams, which are sweet potatoes, macaroni and cheese, then some kind of cornbread, some hot sauce, and then a red drink. And in soul food culture, red is a color and a flavor. We don't get caught up in calling something cranberry or cherry or strawberry. It's just red. And then for dessert, I would say like peach cobbler, banana pudding, sweet potato pie, or pound cake. So that's a typical meal. Next slide. So soul food brings together the culinary techniques, ingredients, and traditions of West Africa, Western Europe, and the Americas. So in West Africa, the typical meal is some kind of savory soup, stew, or sauce served on top of or alongside some kind of starch. So depending on where you are in West Africa, the starch could be rice. There is an indigenous rice culture. It could be cereals like sorghum or millet, or it could be root crops like tropical yams, cassava, or plantains. So this is a representation of the slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade. And the reason why I'm showing you this is of the 10 to 25 million people that come across the Atlantic, only about 4% make their way to British North America. So that's why I argue in my book that soul food, as we understand it, is really a British meal with West African influences. When you go eat with somebody in the Caribbean or South America, you're going to have a more Africanized meal. And a lot of that had to deal with the autonomy that enslaved people had over their diet. Next slide. So what we see, though, is we see, even though this was a forced migration of enslaved people, enslaved Africans did what any other migrant group does. When they get to the new place, they try to recreate home. And if they could do so with the same foods and same ingredients and things that they did in the old country, they do. But the disruption was great. But we do see some kind of, a reestablishment of kind of West African foodways. Grossly oversimplifying. In the antebellum South, enslaved people had their food controlled by slaveholders. So once a week, there would be rations, and it would be 5 pounds of some starch. It could be rice, cornmeal, or sweet potatoes, a couple of pounds of meat, and then a jug of molasses. So enslaved people had to figure out how to survive by gardening, foraging, hunting, fishing, all these other strategies, basically, to have a sustainable diet. So typically, the starch was going to be cornmeal, and then it could be pork, because those were the easiest things to raise in that culture. But what we see in some instances, if enslaved people had autonomy over their diet, those from, say, like Senegal and Guinea-Bissau and that area, Gambia, they would ask for rice as the basis of their rations. People from, say, Ghana, Nigeria would ask for sweet potatoes because that was the most reminiscent of tropical yams. So we see kind of a reassertion of West African foodways. Next slide. Here's an example of a plantation outside of Charleston. In the middle that says pasture. Beyond that would be the area where the commodity crop was grown, tobacco, cotton, indigo, whatever. But in the middle, those numbers there, those are actually the dwellings of the enslaved. And below it, it says Negro Gardens. So actually, in many situations, enslaved Africans and later enslaved African Americans were allowed to grow their own food. And below that, it says poultry grounds. So enslaved Africans and African Americans were also allowed to raise their own livestock. And so the takeaway here is that if you actually look at what enslaved people were eating, it was mostly seasonal vegetables during the week, maybe some water. There might be a little bit of meat in those seasonal vegetables, but that was just really a flavoring agent. And so the things that we think about, like fried chicken, the glorious desserts, all of those things were special occasion food that the enslaved got on weekends. Next slide. So during the Great Migration, which was a 70-year period starting in the early 1900s all the way to the 1970s, millions of African Americans left the South for other parts of the country. And so one of the main arguments in my book on soul food is that just like other immigrant groups, they brought the celebration food of the rural South to other places, and that celebration food became more commonplace. So that people outside the South, and even people outside Black culture, when they looked at soul food, they were focused on the celebration foods like fried chicken, barbecue, all of those things. And so even though soul food is a mix of everyday stuff that I'm going to talk about in a minute, and the celebration food, those were the things that people tended to focus on. And if you eat celebration food more than every once in a while, that's not going to be so great for your body. And I think that's what gives rise to the, I would say, inherent myths about soul food, that it needs a warning label that if you eat this food, it's going to kill you. The message I have is, well, it depends on how the food is prepared and if you're eating it in the proper context. Next slide.
Adrian, we have a question really quickly. Someone asked, are there any ingredients of early soul food brought to North America by the slave trade?
Yeah, so some quick examples are okra. Okra is native to West Africa. Hibiscus, watermelon. There was a type of rice that they tried to grow in the Americas, and it was grown to some limited success. Basically, there was a type of sesame seed as well. So those are just a few examples of some of the things that do come across the Atlantic from West Africa. So thanks for that question. And so people ask me, well, where does this term soul food come from? Well, soul food was existing in Black culture well before the 1960s, but in the 1960s, it's really where it took off. But it comes from the music world. Essentially, jazz artists called that gospel-tinged jazz that was reminiscent of the Black church in the rural South, they were starting to call that soul and funky in the late 40s and the 1950s. So it really was soul music first, and then it was soul brother, soul sister, soul food. Next slide, please. So let's go quickly through some innovative dishes before we get to the trends. And some of these things will be familiar. Next slide. So one thing is chicken and waffles. This is from a place in Denver. So this is fried chicken with basically a red velvet waffle, because we know it's red velvet because that color red does not exist in nature. So some food coloring was definitely added. This is a dish that's very popular in African American culture. Many people believe it started in African American culture. If I had more time, I'd give you the real story about chicken and waffles. It actually comes from Europe, but gets embraced by African Americans. And then in the late 90s, it actually just goes mainstream. So now it's everywhere. Next slide. Okay, I just had to brace you for this one. I don't know how many of you all have had dinner, but this is another interesting dish. Next slide. The Kool-Aid, the Kool-Aid pickle. All right, here's how you make a Kool-Aid pickle. You get a jar of already made kosher dill pickles. Take the pickles out of the jar, either poke holes in the pickles or cut them in half, and then you make Kool-Aid out of the pickle brine. And then you put those cut pickles or pierced pickles back in, close the jar, leave them there for 2 weeks, take them out and eat them. If you like the taste of pickles and of Kool-Aid, it's just a sweet and sour combination. If you don't like either one, this is one of the nastiest things you'll ever put in your mouth. So the question is, where does this come from? Next slide. As I was interviewing elders, they told me they used to do this, peppermint pickles. So you get those big pickles at the corner store, cut off the tip, and then get a peppermint stick that had a hole in it and push it into the soft part of the pickle and let the pickle juice digest it. Yes, you're welcome for the warning. Let the pickle juice digest it, and then they would suck on that. So it was a similar sweet and sour combination. Next slide. And I think it just shows kids just messing around. When I ate my way through the country to research this book, I have to say, LA had the weirdest soul food. So here I went to a place called Tony's Soul Burgers, and they had a Thanksgiving burger. The Thanksgiving burger is bun, all turkey patty, a layer of cheese, a layer of collard greens, a layer of sweet potato puree, a layer of cranberries, a layer of dressings, and then a fried egg and bun. Pretty slamming. All right, next slide. I also went to a place called Otis Jackson Soul Dog. So here's a soul food hot dog. Bun, wiener, collard green and cucumber relish, sweet potato puree drizzle, crumpled bacon bits. Slamming. All right, next slide. I like this place because on the wall they had a mural, which basically, if you've ever seen Good Times, it was a replication of that mural, except everybody had a hot dog instead of a pool cue. I just thought it was cool. All right, next slide. Now let's get into the trends. Okay, in addition to the traditional soul food, next slide, you have Down Home Healthy. And Down Home Healthy is really just taking the fat, salt, and sugar out of soul food. So this, instead of having fried catfish, for example, this is a basically a Creole broiled catfish where you take the catfish fillet, rub it with olive oil, and then put on your favorite Creole seasoning and just broil it for 7 minutes till it's just opaque. Awesome. People love this recipe. It's one of the most popular in my book. And just because Valentine's Day is around the corner, I'm going to pause and give a pro tip, because the people that focus on your health care about all of your health. This is from an ex-girlfriend. So I'm just going to say, if you are dating or married to somebody who's a good cook, do what you can to stay with that person. But if you notice that things are starting to get rocky, I can tell you from personal experience, it's a lot easier to get the recipes before you break up. All right, next slide. Upscale soul is the exact opposite, right? You double down on the extravagance of ingredients. So maybe like duck fat, heritage breed meat, heirloom vegetables, exotic spices. That's one trend. Next slide, please. But I would have to say the hottest trend is vegan. And a lot of people say that vegan is an oxymoron, but really it's a homecoming because of what I said earlier about what the enslaved people are actually eating. So this is from Solely Vegan in Oakland, California. So moving from left to right, southern fried tofu. So fried chicken, tofu shaped like fried chicken, vegan mac and cheese, and collard greens with a cayenne pepper lemonade. The chicken with the tofu, it reminded me more of catfish, but it was tasty. The tofu mac and cheese, I wasn't feeling so much, or I'm sorry, they used almond cheese and almond milk for that because there's no dairy. It just wasn't creamy, so it just didn't remind me of mac and cheese that I was used to, but it's still tasty. And the collard greens were as good as any because, if you know how to season, you can make vegetables taste wonderful and not even miss the meat. All right, next slide. Fusion. So this is like a play on soul food interacting with other ethnic cuisines. And I know I hate that term, ethnic cuisines, but just cuisines of other cultures, I'll say. So there's a guy in Atlanta who calls himself the Blaxican. That's not my term. That's what he calls himself. And so he's doing something like a collard green quesadilla, as you can see on the left. And then one thing you're seeing all over the place are soul food egg rolls. So soul rolls. So essentially it's an egg roll filled with a soul food ingredient. So mac and cheese. This one is showing you chicken and rice and gravy, collard greens, candied yams. I'm seeing that all over the place. Next slide. Another one is stuffed foods. So this is from the Turkey Leg Hut in Houston, Texas. But essentially it's taking things like turkey legs and chicken wings and filling them up with soul food ingredients. So that's just another playful trend that I'm seeing quite a bit. Next slide. And the last thing I'll end is by talking about the future of soul food. So I'm going to tell you about soul food in space. Now you may not know this, but there is a experiment that happens periodically on a volcano in Hawaii, where essentially people try to mimic what it would be like to have a colony on Mars. And the reason why they're there on this volcano in Hawaii is because the soil there is very reminiscent of the soil on Mars. So they're trying to figure out what food will grow in that soil and also what food can grow on a flight to Mars, because any spaceship travel to Mars is going to take at least a year one way. And there's no way they could put enough food on the ship to go all the way to Mars. It would just be too heavy. So they're going to have to figure out what to grow along the way. And so they're looking at things like soul food. They're looking at greens. They're looking at sweet potatoes. They're looking at hibiscus and okra. I actually got a chance to talk to the people at Johnson Space Control in Houston. That's where they do a lot of the food testing. And I found out some interesting things. Really two non-starters when it comes to soul food. The first one is that cornbread is a non-starter in space. The main reason is because cornbread crumbles. So in a zero gravity environment, your spaceship is just going to be straight nasty because there's going to be crumbs everywhere. The other one I found out was a non-starter is chitlins because you can't roll down the window in space. All right. Thank you for a moment just to share with you these soul food trends. Look forward to taking your questions.
Oh my God, Tiffany's face right now.
Adrian. That's amazing. I just knew Adrian was going to say. And so I was up in space and I just knew we were on the way. I just it was going to happen. Incredible work, sir, as always.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate you.
Oh, that's amazing. Oh man, thank you, Adrian, so much for that presentation.
Mhm.
We are about
Adrian, those recipes was straight off the ice cream truck. I know. We used to get them Kool-Aid pickles, man. We used to wait for them.
Yeah, so Wayne and I were texting a moment ago. My mother, still to this day, sticks a peppermint in her pickle. It's never gone away. And in South Park, Houston, Texas, you can still, and in small parts of Lake Charles, Louisiana, you can still get Kool-Aid pickles and peppermint pickles at any liquor store with pickle pig feet and things like that. So,
Oh, really? Okay, I
yeah,
gotta check that out. I didn't know that.
I'll
Okay.
send you some names of some of the. Well, Lake Charles is a little torn up because of Hurricane Laura, but there's still some shacks or some double wides that serve some of those traditionals. Or I'll give you my mom's address; she still does it.
Okay, cool.
I need to challenge you though, man. Red is indeed a flavor, but cranberry ain't never been red.
Fair enough.
You cannot give us red and cranberry. No, it was.
Fair enough.
All right. If anyone has questions, please put them in the chat. Otherwise, I'm going to ask each of you one question and then we will close. So the one question I want to ask you all is, obviously we're talking about history and history that has a lot of gaps. So I would love to hear what each of you thinks about ways in which we can preserve the stories of the past and the stories of the present. So we can start in the order.
Nope, I'm going first because I gotta go. So we're already in the culture of posting every damn thing, sharing every damn thing. If we're going to accept something and share it without researching it, write it down and give credit to where the credit is due. Let us know where you got it from. Create that trail, okay? They're telling us this digital stuff is going to last forever. That's why you shouldn't post any damn thing. But also, write it down. Share it with your children. Write a damn book. Yeah, I haven't done it. Yeah, no, I haven't done it. But if you have a story, put it in paper, put it somewhere so it can be told. But share and credit. Please give credit where the credit is due. That's all I'm gonna say. Love you guys.
Thanks, Ray. Chow, would you like to go next?
Yes. Yeah, I guess the first thing I'm thinking about, because once you learn more about Madeira and its story and how it connects back to us. So I didn't know which question you would ask us, but more or less understand that wine is more documented than us, than Black people. And of course, people are very prideful of the vintages, et cetera. So wine gives us context and you can be able to track, generations before and be able to tell us better stories versus looking for the names. It's almost like we have to be very creative on how we do our research as well, as you heard from Tiffany when she gave a very emotional ending to her presentation. So we almost have to be mystics and we follow the stars. Where do we go? To kind of find the clues to these stories. So for the future of it, always connect back to what could be that one thing that can be the link, because Googling people with my last name ain't gonna work. Or, so we're trying to look for that connection, look for what may be the role of the person. In this case, I'm saying wine, which is a product, or what would be the thing for us to connect to? And in the case where, how do we keep the legacy going? For Madeira I don't know what Barack Obama knows about Madeira, but of course he is aware that the Declaration of Independence was signed, with the toast of Madeira. And so it still becomes American history. And instead of it being Portuguese history or just a white president's history, because Barack Obama in 2009 used Madeira to toast, it is also Black history. So I think that we should continue to make these connections, and let's not keep the gaps. Let's make the connection back to it. So if I can inspire any more people like us to do research on Madeira, to drink Madeira proudly, then I think that's us making sure the legacy continues.
I love that. Let's see, Tiffany.
Oh, that was great. Yeah, I'm gonna just jump on the same thing. If we're gonna speak on hospitality and speak on where we are, we don't, we never use the word slavery. We never use the word enslave at the bar. But if we are going to be at the bar and be of service, I think it's really humbling, as some of us are and some of us are not, is to really serve those drinks with more homage and more stories and the other narrative. And that's the storytelling. We're always telling the story of the brand, the language of the country, but let's really share the story of the service aspect of it moving forward, continuing that story and continuing it with pride of the service industry, whether you are a European or American, whatever kind of money you make, this is a choice that you make to work in this industry. So when you work in it, own it, learn it, put it out there, and gain the respect for it. And take the mic when you have it and speak on it, and really give this industry the heart that we put into it, for sure.
Excellent. Lynn.
I think we have to look at the resources that are before us, and that's our elders, our grandparents, our aunts, our uncles, great grandparents, whoever you've got in your life. No matter where you come from, they all have an experience. And so talk to them about those things and embrace that, share those stories. I think what Dwayne said, write it down. I am desperately trying to get my uncle to write a book, but write it down, document it. It's up to us to preserve and go forward. And we know, particularly in this country and African-American heritage, so much of it is lost because our history wasn't documented. And so now we are in an active state where we can. And so just to take that history, appreciate it, and preserve it.
Beautiful. And then Adrian.
Yeah, just to build on all the things that were said, I would say use technology to our advantage. Not only write these stories down, but turn that camera on, that phone camera on. If your auntie is making that famous biscuit recipe and you've been asking for that recipe, she's like, boy, I don't have recipes. I don't write anything down. I don't measure. Get her permission and just start filming. And then when people are telling stories, get their permission, but turn on that recorder and capture this stuff. Because you always think you're going to remember it crystally clear. And then as time passes, you don't, and you're wishing, my mom died 5 years ago, and there's so many things I was cognizant, and I wrote a lot of stuff down, but there's still some things I'm like, oh man, I wonder why she put that lemon in the barbecue sauce. And you ask, and nobody, they just do it, right? But nobody explains it. So use technology to help.
Excellent. Awesome. Well, I thank you all so much for being here. I cannot stop smiling. I'm really happy I wore this lipstick. But it's been a really lovely discussion, and it's a great way to start off the month. So thank you all for all the work you're doing in your respective areas of work. And we got to do this again. This is not the only time this is happening, y'all. Don't think you're getting away with this. Awesome. And thank you all to everyone who is viewing now and will be viewing later. Really appreciate the support. If you're interested in learning more, check out our website, fohelp.org. Awesome. Thank you, everyone.